Okay, the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, and I think I told you last week when we looked at Matthew that Mark is the first gospel written. Gospel, what's gospel mean? Good news, right? Good story. God's story is different ways and definitions of saying it. So we got 4 gospels, 4 different ways or angles of looking at God's story. And it is listed as God's story is good news. And so when you look at a gospel, I think I mentioned that they should be read. These are news flashes, so to speak. And let me take just a moment in opening to talk a little bit about how the Gospels come about being in the form that we have them in today. Jesus, of course, came, lived, and at age 30 declared his public ministry, right? And for 3 years had preached, and then was crucified, died, resurrected, spent 40 days in different appearances and ascended into heaven. That's the whole story, right? Is 33 years, we'll say. 33 years covers the whole period of time. Before that period of time, do you remember what was before that period of time? 400 years of silence. From when? What was the last thing before the silence began? Malachi, right? The book of Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament. Malachi says, hey, he prophesies there's going to be a great prophet come on the scene, like Elijah. And when he makes that prophecy, he ends his prophecy. There's no more prophets. There's total quiet until God speaks. And of course, we know in Matthew and Luke, we have the story of Jesus' birth. We don't have that in Mark. But then is the whole story of Jesus' life, from the angels coming to Mary and Joseph and Elizabeth and John the Baptist being born in Jesus and all that, all the way up to his ascension is that 33 years. And then Jesus ascends into heaven. And what do you have? Well, you've got 11 guys left, right? Because Judas has betrayed Christ, hung himself. He's gone. You got 11 guys with this thought. Go, with the Great Commission, go into all the world preaching the good news of Jesus Christ and all the things that he did and said and was to all the world. And Jesus is gone, and you got 11 guys to do that. Now, that's a pretty daunting task. But here's the good news. It's a small area, right? It starts out at the day of Pentecost, and then it's kind of blooms because thousands come to Christ. But it's a pretty small task to begin with. So what happens is that they kind of set up shop in Jerusalem, so to speak, and different people get saved, get trained, and teach. But if you want to know the personal acts of Jesus Christ, you get in contact and a disciple tells you. One of them comes to town. It's called the oral speaking period of the Gospels of Jesus. Or how did you know what Jesus did? You didn't have a book, you had a disciple. And so if you didn't have a disciple, you had someone that the disciple had told. So the closer you could get to Andrew or Peter or Bartholomew or John or one of those guys, right, the closer you could get to the story. Now, why didn't they run and write it down immediately? Why would they not just go, wow, this is so good, we got to get this in print? Besides the point, that would have been very expensive, very inconvenient, very difficult to have done in their place and time. besides that, with the great importance of the good news and the story of Jesus, and only 11, why didn't they just record it right away? Any idea? They tell you. If you read Acts, they tell you clearly. They thought Jesus was coming in their lifetime. He's coming back. There's no need to write it down. They absolutely believe before they die, he will return. So why record this? Why take the time and write it down? We'll come to your town. We'll spread the good news. There's no need to record it. So there's a long period of time that it goes that, listen, if you want to know what Jesus did, ask one of the disciples or someone that's been, you'll have a deacon, someone trained in your church that will teach, right? But what begins to happen is the disciples begin to be martyred. So there becomes less disciples to teach. And on top of that, the very worst of scenarios, at least if you're trying to figure spreading the gospel, the disciples, those 11 are dying out, and the church is booming in growth. So the task now is monstrous to share. There's fewer disciples to speak, and on top of that, Jesus has not come. So the thought rings, maybe he will not return in our lifetime. If he does not return in our lifetime, this needs recorded. Does that make sense to you? So someone begins to say in these churches when they go around, and I'm just saying this, but I think you'll find this makes sense. Peter, you need to get this wrote down. Is Peter a writer? Is this old fisherman now, is he supposed to sit down and you think he's the one to put his words into writing? He's not. So they're saying you need to get someone to do that. John Mark will be the one that records it, and the gospel will carry his name. He don't sign his name to his gospel. Nowhere in the gospel does he say, hey, I'm Mark writing this, or hey, I'm writing this in the name of Peter. Why would he? Everybody knows this letter was written, accepted in the church. It was duplicated the best it could, and it was spread as much as it could to all the churches in the area. But the church continues to grow, right? And the disciples eventually all die off. Now, as things continue to progress, and there began to be fewer disciples, there were men like Matthew and Luke, and we know John lived to be 100 years old or older. They believed on the Isle of Patmos in his 90s. And we don't know when he wrote the Gospels. Most believe when he was very, very old. He wrote the Gospel of John. His is totally different. It's 90-some% stuff that you don't find in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, in John. So the three are called synoptic gospels, or they are much the same. So Mark takes on and writes. He writes briefly, and he writes quickly, and he writes as he's heard and learns from Peter, or as he's watched Peter at church teach. And so it won't be no surprise to you, knowing Peter. If I said this about Peter and just what you know, that Peter was quick to speak, would you find that to be true? That Peter reacted to things. Things happening. Peter talked before he thought. Or he...
Sound like Trump.
Yeah. Could be. He got out of the boat when no one else gets the boat. He not only asked to walk on the water, the guy climbs out of the boat. Okay, this gospel is Mark listening to him and watching him under the leadership of the Holy Spirit, writing it down. Matthew and Luke will have the written Mark in hand when they write their gospels. So they will write and add to. But if you look at Matthew and Luke, you will find almost all of Mark in their Gospels. And added to, particularly Matthew, is just massive sections, almost word for word, of Mark. He had it in his hands when he wrote it. He wrote, again, to cover some of this, who did Matthew write to? Who was he trying to impress? Who was he trying to reach? The Jews, right? And so he writes a lot of Old Testament prophecy, and his favorite statement in Matthew is, and as the prophet said, this fulfilled what the prophet said, time and time and time again in Matthew. Mark writes to the Romans. He writes to Gentiles. He writes Peter's words. He's trying to reach them in a whole different fashion. You only find twice that he mentions anything from the Old Testament, anything that was prophecy related. The Romans, the Gentiles, are not interested in prophecy and what was fulfilled in the Old Testament. That's Jewish stuff, right? So he don't start at the birth of Jesus. He starts where Peter was and where John the Baptist was. And he starts clearly with the message. You know, you find in Matthew repeated over and over and over again those words, and that the Old Testament prophets might be fulfilled. Mark, 42 different times in different ways, say these words, and it shows you that he's speaking from Peter's energy, okay? And in the way Peter was, he says, and immediately, and right then, and right now this happened, and right over there, and I can hear Peter standing up preaching when I read Mark. And I think if you read Mark, you'll hear the same thing. Only one sermon of Jesus is listed in Mark. Do you remember last week how many sermons of Jesus are in Matthew? 6. I may have only gave you 5. Remember, the last one could be divided, and I didn't divide it in 2 because it was on the same day in 2 different places. 6, I think they go. So, all sermons, right? All what Jesus said. You read Luke, you're going to find more of the same. All what Jesus said. You read Matthew, and you're going to find 18 parables. 18 short little stories to represent something. Luke, 19 parables. In Mark, it's debatable, but 2 to 4. But you know what you find 18 of in Mark? Miracles. So what he's trying to say to the Gentile, to the Roman, is not what Jesus said, what he did. This is what Jesus did. And so he presents Jesus as the miracle worker to the Gentile Roman. And then you'll go back to Luke, who'll be reaching, do you remember who he's writing to? The Greeks, right? And then John, again, will be writing kind of to everybody. By the way, if you read the Gospel of John, he clearly says that he's writing to older believers. So that you might continue to believe. The Gospel of John's written to older believers, that people that have already committed. He's laying some heavy stuff on them. Matthew is written, if you read it, to young Jewish believers, if you read it. And I don't think there's an age really in Mark and Luke, but I think that's kind of a neat thing to look at. John says that he's trying to get. So if you wanted to share, and you was going to be a Christian witness to somebody, and you wanted them to read the Bible, and I've probably told you this a lot of times, what gospel would you take that Gentile person to the Bible to read? Mark, right? If you ran into a Jew out here in the world that was debating or wondering about, should I, giving Jesus some thought, what gospel would you take him to? You would take him to Matthew. So there's wisdom in how these four gospels are written. If you had a older person in life and had studied and looked a lot, you would have them read John. I think if you had a highly educated person who was debating and looking at Jesus and who he was, you would take him to Dr. Luke. I do believe that all of these relate, and the story does relate, and the Holy Spirit does understand that these four gospels are not one. They're four announcements and pictures and angles of what Jesus did, because he said, go into all the world, and then he gave us the material to do it. Oh, sorry about that. Gave us the material to go into all the world, right? And so you choose the gospel. Listen, I'm not saying that if you talk to some young person that wanted to read Matthew, go, no, you got to read Mark, right? You definitely would, if you could get them to read any gospel, but I just think Mark makes sense to take them there. I do also say, when you got a young person in the church that's looking, that is a new believer besides the gospel, and I want to state this again to you. Do you remember what book I tell you all the time to have them read? The book of James, right? Because James was Jesus' younger brother. He battled, he denied, he never believed in Jesus' lifetime, came to believe after the resurrection, and that pain you read in his words. He can, when he writes to you and you read that as a person that come to know Christ, you come to know Christ. You are a sinner, lost. You were denying him at one time in your life. James's words are just amazing. It is no wonder that the book of James, when you go to find devotional stuff, James is all over the place in that kind of reading. So, to Mark now. You ready to go there? We got any time left? We got a little bit. To the Gospel of Mark. The book is divided out into 3 different sections as you read it. But let's just start out with the first verse and see if in any way you think that Mark gets the way Peter would have wrote this. Because Peter would have jumped right in, head over heels with his point, and let you know exactly what he was talking about, right? See if this sounds like Peter speaking. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. You want to debate it? You want to know what I'm talking about? I'm talking about Jesus Christ and the beginning of him, and he's the Son of God. Now here's my announcement to back up that statement. No diddling around at all. It sounds absolutely like. And I love this. Then he gives us a little history in leading to where they're at in the time. And it says, as it is written in the prophets, behold, I send a messenger. Where is that written? Malachi, right? Before thy face, which shall prepare the way before thee. Who will that messenger be? That messenger will be the voice of one crying into the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Listen, the minute he said that, okay, this is after Jesus' ascension, years have passed. They have heard the story. There are people that stood out, and he takes them where? He takes them to the Jordan River. That's where Mark's gospel starts, at the Jordan River with John the Baptist. They all know who that is. When he says, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, everybody goes, John? John? You mean that John? Well, I heard about him, or I seen him, or I went out there. Many of them would say, I was baptized by that guy. And what did he baptize in the remittance of sin? And there went out to him all the land of Judea and they of Jerusalem, and were all baptized to him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. And John was clothed with camel hair and with a girdle of skin about their loins, and he did eat locusts and wild honey, and preached, saying, There cometh one mightier than I after me, the latchet of whose shoes I am not worthy to stoop down and unloose. I indeed baptize you with water, but he shall baptize you with the Holy Ghost. And then he goes, It came to pass in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized of John in Jordan. Why is that important? Why does he start out this way? He's not writing to the Jews. The Romans hear of this John the Baptist guy. They're not interested in him as the Jewish. Remember the Pharisees and the Sadducees hanging around? But they hear of him. He's beheaded by who? Herod, right? So they hear of him, they know, and many of them have said, Well, I thought John the Baptist was that guy you're talking about. So when he immediately in his announcement, his preaching, he brings up what's familiar to them, John the Baptist. And what about John the Baptist? Well, he preached out there, you remember? And he said that Jesus, he wasn't even worthy to latch at his shoes. That's what John the Baptist, the guy you all know, and some of you went out there and seen, and some of you were baptized. He said he wasn't even worthy to latch at Jesus' shoes. And John baptized him. And straightway coming out of the water, he saw the heavens open, and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him. And there came a voice from heaven saying, Thou art my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And immediately the Spirit driveth him out of the wilderness. He leaves no doubt in these first few verses here what he is speaking of. He's speaking of 3 years ago. In Jesus' ministry, in his lifetime, 3 years prior to his death, Jesus had went out to John the Baptist, and he had been baptized, and the heavens had opened, and God's voice had spoken, and the Spirit had descended on him, and God had called him his Son. I would love to take time to go into the next verse. I won't tonight, but it's amazing that from that second, the Spirit drives Jesus to the wilderness. To a lot of us, that don't make sense. This is a high moment, the announcement of his ministry. He comes out, the heavens are open, God is speaking, the Spirit is descending, and bam, he's in the wilderness with the devil. 40 days of fasting and a battle and a challenge of everything he stands for, everything he is. Satan comes at him. And God allows that. Mark records it. Jesus handles that, but at the end of that, when you get in verse 15, verse 13 ends the first section of Mark, verses 1. Chapter 1 through 13 is one section. It is the introduction as Jesus from John as the divine Son of God. He takes just 13 verses to do that. He will start at verse 14 and he will go all the way through chapter 8. I think verse 27. And he will present Jesus as the divine miracle worker, and he will show miracle after miracle that Jesus did. And at the end of 8 through the end of chapter, he will present Jesus as the divine sacrifice. You'll find a few days here in these first 13 verses. You'll find almost 2 years by the time you get to chapter 8. And then like 6 months in the last half of Mark, talking up to his crucifixion. He gets to that. He is headed to that crucifixion like a freight train. It's just giving you details. He's telling you what Jesus did. Jesus came, was baptized. Jesus touched person after person and healed him. Jesus died for you. And he leads 100 miles an hour right into that crucifixion. And it ends just as quickly as it starts. No talking of after Jesus' death appearances and all the visits and all of the things. No talking. Amazing. This is Peter's story, right? I find this amazing in Peter's character, and I hope we all can find this in our life. Nowhere in all of this do we find Peter's highest, most glorious moment of forgiveness for his denial 3 times. When Jesus sits on the beach with him, and the fish are there, and he looks at Peter, and 3 times. Remember, Peter denied Jesus 3 times, right? That's as bad as it can get for a disciple of Jesus. 3 times he denies him. He said, I don't even know him. It don't get any worse than that. But John and the Gospels say, but listen, later on, in the 40-day period after Jesus ascended on the beach, Jesus sits down and says, Peter, do you love me more than these? 3 times. And it's making clear, they're making clear to you, Peter was forgiven. Jesus took time to work things out with Peter. Peter does not tell that story in the Gospel of Mark. He only tells of his own failures. He's not afraid of the reality of life. That he was a man. And so when he records this, he tells of his denial. There is some debate over whether John Mark maybe wrote that, because if you study Mark, the ending on Mark is believed the last few verses. If you get some Bibles, you won't even find them there, because they tell you in the early transcripts, those last few verses weren't there. There could be some reasons that they weren't found. And then there is a manuscript that's found, but they don't believe Mark wrote those last few verses. There's some reasons maybe behind that. And again, that's a lot of speculation looking in. But one may be that the Gospel of Mark was not used a lot in the early churches as Matthew and Luke become newer material, and more the Christmas story and all the things added in there. Mark kind of got laid aside and forgotten. And it is believed that in a lot of the early manuscripts, it could have just been lost the last little bit. This was not written on a book. So things could have easily been lost. I heard one guy suggest that maybe Mark did write of that end, and Peter didn't like it, and Peter himself tore those last verses off, and he didn't want that all told. He did, and so maybe he took it off there. But anyway, if you look in, if you hear that in a study, that is true that those last verses added in there are a little different. But listen, whatever was added was accepted by the early church. It isn't like someone 10 years ago wrote this, or 100 years ago. Back in all of those guys' day, the ending was found, was placed in there. It's as inspired as any rest of the book. Those that take that out of the Scripture, I question the translation that does that. I would not own that translation that takes those verses out of Mark and doesn't even record them there. Because, again, it is accepted in the early church. And our Bible eventually came into writing because as Mark, Luke, John, and Matthew wrote these letters and they were circulated to the church, years and years later it became apparent to what? Maybe that pieces and things were getting chipped. And the story was getting farther and farther away. And so with the concern of all that, there came a day when it was decided that we need to canonize, or we need to find what the church is calling inspired and what the church has accepted for all these years as the holy word of God. And we need to eliminate what isn't, and we need to accept what is, and we need to put that into what we call the Bible today. And that's what they did. They took those letters and they put them together and bound it, so to speak, as we now have it, and we're blessed to have that. Does that kind of give you the age from the oral to the beginning writing to the canonizing of the Bible and why they did it? Later on, listen, you don't want to be running over Jerusalem looking at a copy of Mark, right, to read, so they eventually put it and pulled the letters of importance, put them together. Are there other Gospels? Are there others that wrote and said this is the story of Jesus? Yes. But they never were accepted by the early church. They never were circulated among them. There are letters found, but they're not put in this Bible because they never were accepted by the early church. These 4 letters were the ones that were. So when people tell you, oh, I don't want the Bible, they eliminated books, the Apocrypha and some of that, they didn't even put it in the Bible. Well, the early church didn't put it in the Bible. It wasn't the ones that canonized it. They never accepted those as inspired from God. So I hope that helps you understand a little better. Mark himself, in kind of bringing this to a close, who was this guy? Well, Acts, I think chapter 12? Where in Acts is it? Acts chapter 12, we find out he's the son of Mary. He's the son of Mary, and we find that out because Peter's arrested. He's put in prison, and they're going to kill him. But God decides to set him free. And Peter is freed, and the door's just open, and he just walks out. And it says he goes down to the house of Mary, John Mark's mother. So we learn who John Mark's mother and where his house is. Then with records and historical things, we have come to understand that where the upper room was, where the Lord's Supper was instituted, was also Mary's house, it is believed. It's John Mark's home, where Jesus, remember, he sent 2 of the disciples, said, go, and you'll find a guy carrying a pot on his head. Ask him, and if you can use his house, and he'll take you and get you. And he goes to the house, and then they set up, and they have the supper up there. That's believed almost assuredly to be John Mark's home. Now, I tell you that to tell you, just to put a kind of the end of Mark and put it of interest to you to read, because that's my goal, right? Quite possibly John Mark's there. We know the disciples sing. Jesus teaches. They wash feet. Judas leaves. There's a lot happening in that room up there. There's a young man there at home. And I'm speculating. I only can think of things as I would think of myself. I think I might have had an ear to the door. I might have had an interest in this great miracle worker teacher. There's a question of whether he had been a follower of Jesus anyway. They leave. They leave to go a short distance to the garden where Jesus, later that night, will be betrayed and the soldiers will come and arrest him. We know what Jesus did in that garden because it's recorded in Mark. He prayed. We also know that no one's there when he prays, because he leaves them all except 3, and he takes them a little farther, and he says, wait here, watch, and do what? Pray while I pray. What do those guys do? They fall asleep. He prays, and he comes back and he wakes them up, right? And he says, hey, watch and pray while I go and pray. We know he sweats like drops of blood in that garden. While what? The disciples are sleeping. He goes back the third time, and what's he say that time? Sleep on. Now, I just want to put this story together because there's a young man writing this gospel who records what Jesus prayed, as if he's somewhere around, maybe snuck out of the house as they left and grabbed a bed sheet and wrapped around himself and came to see what would go on in that garden late at night. And so he hears quite possibly what Jesus said. Not my will, but thine will be done. Did the disciples hear that? They're sleeping. Could Jesus have told them that? He could have. Could Mark have heard that? I think more likely. Why do I think that? Because after the arrest and everything happens, John goes with Jesus. All the other disciples flee over the hill, and Peter follows afar off, it says, right? But while they're searching and finding no disciples, the soldiers, they don't find Peter, but they find some young guy wrapped in a bed sheet. And it says they grabbed the bed sheet, and he left the bed sheet in their hands and run off. Who could know about this guy? Except the writer of this gospel. The eyewitness, the person that actually was there. I believe that's John Mark. I believe he personalizes and he writes about himself being there and fleeing in the end. And it makes sense to me. If he was there and he was awake and he's following in and behind Peter and them in the end, and they grab for him and he gets away. Quite possibly, he's a young kid snuck up there listening to what's going on, and a good possibility he heard the prayer in the garden while everybody else slept. Now, that's all speculation on my part. But if that isn't enough to make you read the Gospel of Mark to see, could that be right, Pastor Fred? Well, I don't know what else to tell you. And you come to your own conclusion when you put all those facts together. You're 16 chapters away from knowing. You can just pick up the Bible and read it. You'll find that guy in that bed sheet fleeing in the garden. You'll find the listed prayer there in chapter, I don't remember, I don't remember where it is near the end. You'll find that. Jesus, by the way, as Mark divides out when he gets to the end of that second section, chapter 8, there's a turn towards that last 6 months. I want to put that in there so you know in that turn what it is. Jesus, for the first time, quits telling people, don't tell people who I am. And for the first time, after 2 years of being with the disciples, he asked the disciples, who do people say I am? So it's all been secret until chapter 8, and then he looks at the disciples and he says, okay, I've told everybody to keep quiet, not to tell people who I am, but who do you say I am? And Peter gets that one right, doesn't he? You are the Messiah. You are the Son of God. And Jesus says, Peter, not Simon, Peter, you are the rock. And upon that bit of knowledge given to you from God, I'll build my church. So, any thoughts about Mark you all want to share?
One thing you made me think of is when you're talking at the first, when you're talking about the disciples why they didn't write, because they were busy doing things, and they thought Jesus would come back. Well, when I was newly married and we had a little baby, and we were Jesus freaks, and really into the end times and the rapture, and we never thought the kids would even, our son would even end up in
we
school.
didn't either.
And now he's 45 now, so that didn't happen. But I could see how they would anticipate his soon coming,
Yeah. And I think that, of course, that verse in Thessalonians tells us to always preach that Jesus is coming. This is our hope, and use these words as encouragement. And of course, the disciples believed with all their heart that he would return in their lifetime. And I believe that with my heart. I'm like you. I sat and have cried thinking, I'll never see my kids raised because Jesus will come. But I'm glad that Jesus is going to come and they won't face all those things. And I remember thinking that as they were growing up. And I lived in Monroe City, so they weren't very old, thinking Jesus would return before my kids got grown. And they're getting up there in years too. I haven't got no 45. What is Kenny? 41. So, but now I watch the events of today and I think, and listen, the second coming of Jesus was always meant to be inspiring to us, something that we kept on our mind and believed was going to happen. That's why it happens in a thief as a thief in the night. If you ever cease to believe, well, you've made a mistake. When you say, I don't believe he's coming now, you have picked a date. You said it ain't this date. You're as bad as the one that says he's coming tomorrow. I don't think we can say he's coming tomorrow, but you can't say he isn't. I hear guys say all the time, well, there's things that's got to be fulfilled. Let me tell you, God can fulfill everything that needs to be fulfilled like that. Jesus could come tomorrow. And for the Christian, that's okay. We want to do all we can. I know when Jesus will come, whenever he has fulfilled and reached the last soul that he's going to reach before the rapture will happen. Everything to God is with souls. He is concerned about souls. And so I think when the last soul before the rapture is prepared, I think with the second coming, we have a 7-year period. We know when that's going to happen, after the rapture. But I think with the rapture, there's that last person to be saved. The rapture happens, the 7-year period. Jesus comes the second coming. That's all she wrote. Anyway, hey,